used particularly by villagers who live near the lakeshore. Lake Malawi is a 365-mile long lake running up the entire side of the country. A lot of the nets end up getting used as fishing nets, so not used for their initial purpose at all. And so what you find is once the direct support ceases, ultimately the intervention fails. And then there'll be a sort of pause, and then someone will come along and say, we need to solve the malaria problem, let's distribute some mosquito nets. And so you go round the symptom intervention cycle once more. And then where smallholder programs do exist, 80% of Malawi's economy is agrarian. So there's a number of companies that already do smallholder programs. But a lot of these programs don't have a symbiotic relationship with their smallholders. They've created a dependency. And what happens is that if you work on a large coffee plantation, tea plantation, or if you're producing tobacco for one of the big tobacco companies, the companies will provide you the schools, and they'll provide you the healthcare, and they'll provide you the shops, because quite often you're in very rural areas. And the problem that leads to is the fact that people can't afford to leave. And so you create this little closed economy where you're dealing with a fixed number of smallholders, and the value of that economy, you know, the company run the shop, so the company is making money back off their workers. And so you have this little closed system. And then at the right-hand end of the spectrum, you have the sustainable economy, that, you know, the economy that we'd all recognize through MBA studies and from various parts of the world that we all come from, of, you know, a mature, established economy. And that leaves you this gap in the middle. And it is this gap that Dave was dead set on trying to fill. And he wanted to fill it with MML's, Moringa Miracles template, so that other people could follow it. So having identified the gap he was going to fill, because my father-in-law didn't do things by halves, you know, he sort of went for it in a big way. He faced a problem, and one is the one we've just talked through: how do you break the aid cycle? But secondly, once he'd sort of hit upon the idea of Moringa as the potential solution, how do you produce enough of it efficiently and be able to provide a crop year round? And how do you generate sufficient volumes of Moringa seed in order to satisfy the demand for Moringa oil? And the issue there is the amount of space you need, the amount of land you need to grow the sufficient number of trees to grow or to produce the quantity of seed that you need. So his solution was Moringa Miracles. He conducted a proof of concept where we produced leaf powder on the company farm, and then through smallholders produced the more mature trees to produce the seed that could lead to oil production. He came up with the following vision and mission, which you can read through yourselves. And the proof of concept trials actually allowed us to produce 10 tons of powder per hectare per year, as opposed to industry norms of 3 to 4 tons per hectare per year. And in terms of the smallholders, you know, we suddenly found that by working with NGO partners, we could access a significant number of smallholders. And therefore, in terms of the volume of seed we could produce, we found that actually by working with partners, we could produce a significant amount. So in theory, what did it look like that we were doing? We kind of followed this model. And in contrast to the smallholder programs I talked about a little bit earlier, where it became a closed system, this approach allows us very much to be able to overlay a social entrepreneurship approach to working with the smallholders. So instead of getting them to sell to each other, instead of working them in a system whereby they're working in what I sort of termed that closed economy, we're making them part of a value chain that is selling to international markets. And that's key, because it means there is a demand outside of the domestic demand. And that's key because when you have pressures on the economy, when you have natural disasters, when you have food insecurity or whatever, and there's not the money to go around, then trying to sell to a domestic market is clearly quite a difficult thing to do. And therefore your market might disappear. By selling to an international market through us, then that level of demand potentially is going to be proofed against those kind of pressures. So in practice, what do we look like? So on the one hand, we have the powder production on the company farm, and that's an operation that we control ourselves. And there's a number of reasons for that, but principally because we can ensure that things are grown organically and that we can ensure the levels of hygiene required, because the moringa powder will be sold as a foodstuff. Now, the moringa oil isn't, and therefore levels of hygiene are slightly less important. And in terms of the growing of the plants, it's much easier to let the plants grow to maturity than it is to be growing plantations of moringa that we want to produce powder from. So what I'll do now is I'll just briefly talk you through the smallholder program, and that's the infographic on the left-hand side of the slide. So we donate the trees and the seedlings to the smallholders, and we provide the training to those guys of how to look after them and how to coppice them and how to make sure, you know, they're not eaten by animals in the very early stages of their life cycle. And after a year, the trees will produce their first seed. They're exceptionally fast growing. They'll grow 3 to 4 meters in a year. And you can use every single part of the plant for something. So principally, we will be looking at the seed, the leaf that's turned into powder, and then the biomass that comes from that. Now, the agreement we have with our smallholders is that we will want first refusal for the seed that they produce. We can't contract to them at this stage of the game for all the seed that they can produce, and they understand that relationship. So we get first refusal, and if we can't buy their seed, we tell them, and then they can sell that seed at local market, or they can produce their own cooking oil, or they can do their own water purification, which I'll touch on in just a second. So the only thing that we're interested in is the seed. Everything else can be sold at a local market. And we're working with our NGO partners to raise awareness of the benefits that moringa can bring once you include it in your diet. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. So ultimately, what that allows you to do, not only does it provide MML with the seed that it requires, but it gives a number of second order benefits that are at the bottom of the diagram. The first is a nutritious foodstuff for their own families, the purification of water, the fact that the biomass, when it's fed to animals, makes cattle 30% heavier and lactate 30% more. It provides shade. So when you do agroforestry, and you do planting the trees around the outside of the smallholding, it provides shade. So therefore, there's less evaporation from the staple crops they might be growing. And another point that's absolutely crucial to how we work is, unlike a lot of programs, for example, the growing of chilies or any other cash crop, we're not asking the smallholders to do this instead of what they're already growing in the form of staple crops. What we're doing is we're simply asking them to grow these trees around the outside of their plantations, and therefore they get a double win because they have 2 crops to sell as opposed to the 1. And therefore they're also not going to go hungry if the bottom falls out of the market, or for whatever reason we're not buying the moringa that they produce. So in terms of the SDGs, which is always a good way to try and balance how you're performing, we will impact directly and indirectly 14 of the 17 UN SDGs. We work in a region where 45% of the children suffer from stunted growth, where 50% of rural illness is caused by dirty water, where mothers suffer from anemia because of iron deficiency due to breastfeeding, and moringa can help address that. There's more iron in moringa than there is in spinach. And we can potentially eradicate vitamin A deficiency. There's 7 times the amount of betamin, which is the building block for vitamin A, than there are in carrots. And so we have the potential to have significant impact. And what we're trying to do is convince some of the donor agencies to start using moringa powder in their feeding programs and create a circular economy. So rather than making an intervention spend lots of money on a food supplement that comes from overseas into a country, you're spending it internally and allowing you to have what was on the previous slide, that Malawian grown solution to a Malawian problem. And we've worked out that the humanitarian feeding program alone in Malawi is worth $13.5 million if Moringa was used as a supplement, as opposed to using supplements from overseas. And the vast majority of that would go to the smallholders that we work with, because they would be able to supply those programs. Looking at a couple in sort of key detail, our operations will increase smallholder incomes by 61%. So it's around about $200 a smallholder. For water, crushed moringa, once you've produced the oil, is a natural water purifier, and will generate enough crushed seed to purify 182 million litres of water per annum. And the smallholders, again, have the option of whatever they don't sell to us is crushing their own seed to purify their own water. And that is literally a case, as you see in that diagram, having two vessels to hold the water, and you put the right ratio of crushed seed in, you leave it, you filter it, and then you have potable drinking water. We're working with one of our partners to deliver efficient cook stoves across our programs. And the efficient cook stoves will reduce the demand for firewood by 46%. And then in addition to where I said we grow trees around the small holdings, where there's no space for them to do that, they have the option as growing clubs to grow communally, and they also have the option to grow around water catchment areas and on hillsides where deforestation has taken place. By the time we've planted our 3.4 million trees that we plan to over the next couple of years, we'll be in a position to sequester 387,000 tonnes of carbon per annum. And that gives yet another revenue stream for the smallholders through the potential of carbon credits. And that's something that we're actively investigating now. So where are we now? Well, when I first got involved in this program, I did a very straightforward military bit of planning, and I worked out what resources I need, what timeline I expected everything to take place over, and therefore at what stage we'd reach success. And then I presented this fantastic plan, because obviously it was a fantastic plan, presented it to a friend of mine who's a bit of a business guru, and he looked at me and laughed, and he said, right, the best bit of advice I can give you is this. Whatever time you think you're going to take, double it and add a year, and you'll be somewhere close to what you need. And the message there is to make sure that you have enough resilience in your people, enough time and enough money to be able to react to that. So what did he mean, and why was he so skeptical of my plan? Well, the challenges we face have been pretty significant. From an investment point of view, it's understanding from the investors of what a social enterprise actually is, that you're not a non-profit, you're not an NGO, but yet you are not a full-blown commercial enterprise. And therefore they find it hard to try and position where your levels of return might be. On a domestic front, Malawi investors are exceptionally risk averse because they've been burnt so many times. And if they want big donors like the European Investment Bank to carry on giving them money, they need to be seen to look after that money and invest it wisely. So they tend to invest only in sort of growth companies and steer well clear of anything to do with primary agriculture at all. Just to highlight the cost of borrowing, we're currently in very late stage negotiations just now for $1 million round of investment, which will get the sort of yes, no at the end of this month, hopefully. But the fees attached to that before we've even spent any money on repaying the loan are $101,000. And it also comes with a number of imposed criteria. So in this instance, people are looking beyond aren't looking beyond the ownership issue of the company, because we're a white Malawian owned company. And they're not looking to the fact we're going to lift 325,000 Malawians out of extreme poverty. They're just simply looking at, well, who's on the board, who owns the company, and are my donors going to be happy with that? And then moving on to donors, the sort of environment that is created by a lot of the donor agencies, because they pay high wages and because they have exceptionally good working conditions. And by that, I mean things like per diem rates. So that's your day rate if you're working away from the office on some sort of field visit. It's very hard to compete. And so what you find is there's like a mini brain drain. And that means that a lot of the talent goes to work for the international agencies. And it's very, very hard to get the best talent to come and work for private enterprise. There's also a perception that because you work with smallholders, you're there to try and somehow rip the smallholders off and exploit them for your own benefit. And it takes a lot of convincing that you are actually, you're not just saying you're a social enterprise, that there is, some truth behind the claims that you're making. And then that gets a little bit confused when you then approach some organisation for grants, because again, we've had 2 occasions where we've been told, we love your programme, we love the idea, we love what you're doing, but we can't give you a grant because you're white. And you think to yourself, okay, that's a little bit frustrating because there's 325,000 Malawians who'd be thanking you if you did back the project. And a final challenge is talking to large-scale buyers, because what you need to be able to do is if you can get some big offtake agreements, if you can get some big letters of intent, it's much, much easier, obviously, to go for the investment. But the large buyers aren't going to talk to you, even if you've got the best backstory in the world, because simply they want to go to a one-stop shop to get all of the product that they require. So combined, how do these factors impact progress? It does this to your plan. In the left-hand end of the funnel, the amount of time you've got contracts massively, the money starts drying up, and people start having doubts about your amazing plan in the first place. And what it leads to is, you might fall short of success, but you've got to have the resilience to be able to mitigate these issues and navigate the issues in front of you. And whilst you still believe in what you're doing, then, keep charging towards success. And some of the things that come out of left field, you can't predict. And I'll just give you some examples of the journey I've had to date. So the ones highlighted in red are where things have gone very badly wrong, and the ones in green are where things have gone very well. And the one in black at the bottom is the one we're sweating on at the moment. The investment committee meets at the middle of next week, and we'll find out at the end of next week if we're going to go forward with that investment round or not. So I'll just highlight a couple of these. The Feb 17, the Opportunity International Bank Malawi. We applied for a loan in dollars, and they expedited our application following FNB's withdrawal of their loan support prior. And we had a $500,000 non-repayable grant contingent on getting this money in place. But the loan was offered to us in local currency, in kwacha, and at a 39% interest rate. So we did the sums, and for a number of reasons, particularly the interest rate, we had to say no, so we lost the grant. Moving on to Feb to June 2018, we did a program. We established our own smallholder program. That was brilliant. And then we did a program with a World Bank project, which was run by a British consultancy. And the British consultancy, we thought, okay, this is great because they'll have a really good handle on what's going on. So we donated 400,000 trees across the smallholder program they were working with. We went out and we did site visits to various locations where there were trees, and things were going so well. We were having photographs, databases, you name it, of how well the trees were doing, that we paid for organic certifiers to come up and certify the program. And they got there, and I had a phone call from one of them to say that they were in a field. We told them there were trees and there was nothing there. And then when we did some more digging, it transpired that the first round of extension officers had basically lied about the success of the program. And then the next round, when they went to check on the first round, exacerbated the lie, because no one wanted to say actually the trees have failed or haven't been planted or have been stolen or whatever. So when we did a 100% check, we found that 394,000 of the trees had gone missing, which was a bit of an eye-opener and a bit of a sort of sucker punch, really. And that sort of conspired in May 18, where we failed to get another round of grant funding, to ask ourselves, is it time to stop? Because we're not making any great headway, really. And are we just costing ourselves money? But then as the roller coaster happens, you know, we got a cook stove deal came through that essentially saved the company, and then, you know, a whole sort of number of sort of upticks in the list that follows. And one thing that helps you keep going is partner organizations. So here's some examples of the ones that we currently work with. There'll be some there that undoubtedly you know, and others that you won't necessarily. But the point about partner organizations, and a really good takeaway, is the fact that it's really nice to be able to pick up the phone and talk to them, you know, because you come off buoyed by the conversation you have. So if you're having a bad day or things go wrong, it's a really good thing to be able to do, just to remind yourself of why it is you're doing this to yourself. And ultimately for Moringa, there's the potential to scale. On the left is where Moringa grows. On the right is where malnutrition happens around the world. So in terms of using us as a template, you know, the potential impact could be huge. So how's the MBA helped me? I'll just highlight a couple of these on this list. The first one, the credibility, is key. You know, it's great having an army officer background because it gives you the confidence to do, you know, an awful lot of stuff you might not otherwise do. But people generally don't understand what bomb disposal is all about, particularly in a business environment. And so consequently, the fact I can now say, or I will be able to in 6 months if I ever get my dissertation finished, you know, MBA, is crucial. And it gives you the confidence, you know, no more imposter syndrome. I can quite happily hold my own now in various meetings. And the other thing I will highlight is the network. It's events like this, it's other external speakers, it's the wider opportunities that come from the connections you'll make on the course are potentially huge. So is social enterprise something for you? Well, first of all, let's do a little bit of myth busting. This is how the UK government sees social enterprises. And I have to say it's a particularly unhelpful definition. This is their current definition. And this is unfortunately where a lot of people see where social enterprise fits on the scale. Whereas the truth is it sits far more here in the spectrum. So it's not on the left-hand end of the spectrum where it's, you know, the tree hugger end of the spectrum. It's far more across the breadth of the middle. And I would see MML at the right-hand end of that third red circle in the diagram at the bottom. And I think that's crucial because if you can get investors to understand that that is the case and not the diagram at the top, then you'll start beginning to convince them that you can provide the returns that they want in order for them to invest in you. So a number of the myths that I've sort of had as we've been going through, you know, purpose over profit is, well, for us, it's the opposite. You know, it's profit is key, because without profit, we don't exist, and therefore we can't have the impact that we have. Without profit, we can't use some of the additional funds that we've generated to do direct interventions with our smallholders. In terms of salary, we pay competitive salaries, so we pay market rate salaries. We're not paying under. So, you know, there are companies out there, no doubt, that will pay less, but then it's in many respects no different to a typical commercial marketplace. And the number of social enterprises is growing all the time, and they're of all sizes. And I would argue that it enhances your CV. You know, you can become a change maker. Either you start your own social enterprise, or depending on what stage of your career you are, you dip into it, you wrestle with a problem, and then you can add that to your CV, the fact that you set up the approach to solving a particular problem, and now you're looking to come back into the commercial world. That's going to read to me far better than someone who's worked in the same office for the time it took you to dip out of the commercial world and into the world of the social enterprises. And we'll talk about opportunities in just a sec. So the key difficulties is getting people to understand what it is and what it is you want to do. And essentially, the problem we have is you have a 20th century funding model for what are now 21st century business models. And that's why it's so important to get people to understand. And then it's just making sure you have the resilience and the resources in place in order to make sure you can last the distance, because there's nothing worse. Imagine the marathon runner. You know, there's nothing worse than getting to the home straight and your legs go, and you're wobbling all over the place. You can see the finishing line, but you can't quite get there. So it's making sure that you've got the resources in place to do it. So in terms of opportunities, you know, what sort of opportunities do exist? Now, this slide is slightly dated, unfortunately, but the message is key. 63% of social enterprises in 2011 were profitable. And even back then, they're talking about a $500 billion investment pot. So the opportunities do exist and the money is there if you can find the right investor. In terms of the UK picture, the picture just pre-COVID was this. And again, it's quite a compelling, quite a thriving element of the community. So if you're going to take the plunge, what are some of the considerations that you need to take? So if I just talk you through the sort of rather crude diagram, sort of you in the middle is the triangle. You know, you have to decide how much risk you are willing to take, you know, be that financial risk, be that relationships with your friends and family. So taking my example as a case in point, you know, my wife's family thought it was fantastic that I wanted to get involved in this project, clearly keeping my father-in-law's dream alive. My family, who have all been public servants, thought I was absolutely crazy. They thought, I'm leaving the military, which is a steady job. It's got promotion prospects. It provides me a good salary and a house. And I'm going to throw all of that away to follow some sort of pipe dream in the back end of sub-Saharan Africa somewhere. And what it does is it places strain on those relationships. I always remember my father turning around to me one day in that sort of fatherly way and looking at me saying, well, you know, don't worry, son, we're sure one day common sense will prevail. Meaning, once you wake up to yourself, you'll probably join the army or rejoin the army, and this will all be a bit of a distant memory. But I use that to spur me on. So whilst it's caused friction with my family, the balance is Laura's family, my wife's family think it's great. And so it partly depends on where you sit on that risk spectrum. And then it's understanding the angles that other people come from and the other pressures come from. You know, your colleagues might think that you're crazy, leaving a consultancy job, for example, and working in social enterprise. You might have a mentor or coach who's actually looking at it from a completely different perspective. And so it's a question of balancing all these things. But the key thing to remember is it's a constant cyclic process. It's not a case of do it once and put it to bed, because circumstances change. When we've had extreme cash flow issues with the project, you know, my wife said to me on a number of occasions, do you think it's time to stop? And I've been too stubborn to stop, frankly, and I've wanted to continue and I've wanted to make it work. And we're now, hopefully, you know, we're potentially days away from a $1 million round of investment. So I'll just finish up with the final slide. Just highlighting a number of resources. Feel free to link in, because it's all about the network, and my company website's there. And then just a list of really good resources to tap into all about social enterprises, and a couple worth highlighting. The Scholl Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at Said Business School is exceptional, as is the Ashoka website, and they have a global reach as well. And then GSEN is the global network of social enterprise, global social enterprise network, beg your pardon. Another one well worth looking at. So that's me. That's the rattle through of my sort of crazy journey from bomb disposal into growing trees in Malawi. I'm more than happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Hi, Ian. It's been great, really, really inspiring. I can see your motivation there. So, okay, D, you want to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. It is very interesting. I would like to ask about the challenge that you have faced during the social enterprise, because you mentioned that, okay, during the social enterprise process, you have to dealing with lots of parties like the farmers, impact investors, NGO, government. I think it is pretty challenging in my opinion. So I would like to ask you, like, how can you set the priority to dealing with each party, and like tell me some like suggestions on how to dealing with lots of parties in one time. Thank you.
Sure. It's a good question, because lots of people do, there are lots of stakeholders that you do work with, but for us the most important is our smallholders, because as I said in the presentation, we've built a symbiotic relationship with them. So without them, half of the business model doesn't work. So everything revolves around those guys. And if you can't get that bit right, then the rest is frankly irrelevant. We're lucky in Malawi in that there are so many NGOs. If we fall out with one, or we decide we can't work with one, there are plenty of others that will happily step into their place. And one thing we've been very keen to do is we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to replicate things that are happening already. So if we find a smallholder program being run by an NGO, we will go and approach them and overlay our Moringa on top of that existing program. And if we can make that work, great, because if you look at Southern Malawi in particular, it's a little bit like a Venn diagram with a number of smallholder programs that overlap each other because there's no coordination, because everybody wants to do their own thing and be helpful. But when you speak to the villages, they kind of roll their eyes because you're the third program that's come to invite them to be part of a program. And it's just far more straightforward if you can piggyback on the back of someone else's. So smallholders first and everyone else a distant second, really.
Thank you, Iain. Dee, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Iain.
Okay, we have a question from Madeline. What was the key point that helped you to develop the distribution channel?
Okay, so the distribution for us is relatively easy because we work with, we sell to the wholesale market. So we have a few number of major clients. And that's very helpful because Malawi being landlocked, logistics are frighteningly expensive and can be really quite difficult. So for example, air freight costs 3 times the level from Malawi to the east coast of the US than it does from Johannesburg to the east coast of the US. And Johannesburg is only 2 hours additional flying time. So in terms of distribution, we work with a handful of traders in South Africa. We also do direct sales to the US. So at this stage, distribution is relatively straightforward. In the future, when we look to branch into our own brand produce, that's when it'll become a little bit more difficult. And that's where we'll investigate things like selling on Amazon platforms, as an example, where we'll export to a European country and then look to distribute via Amazon or a similar platform from there.
Right, thanks, Iain. Does that answer your question, Madeline? Yeah, okay, that's great. Okay, so we have a question from Jeff. What have been some of your biggest surprises in your social enterprise journey?
Biggest surprises? I think the biggest surprise is kind of a negative surprise. And it's the fact that a lot of donors can't see beyond an ownership issue to see the impact that you're actually having with the company. So, when we say to people, we're going to lift 325,000 Malawians out of extreme poverty, I would imagine that most people would go, fantastic, that's really, really good, and overlook the fact that you're a white-owned company in that part of the world. But the negotiations we're having just now, one of the stipulations is by year 5, we have to be a 25% employee-owned company. And that's because people are tied to the idea that you have to have a degree of black ownership. But my counter argument, so first of all, I should explain, we've signed up to that as a condition. But my counter to it was, what you're going to do is you're going to make 50 employees in Malawian terms exceptionally rich potentially when they leave the company and cash in their shares. What you're stopping us doing is doing more direct interventions with our smallholders, which is going to have a longer lasting impact than just making 50 guys very rich. Thank you very much. And that's kind of the argument. So that's the sort of thing I've been really surprised I'm having to deal with, because I thought people would have looked at our performance against the various SDGs and been very supportive of the program.
Right. Yes. That's it. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, Joseph has a question. Okay, so before you take that good decision on social enterprise, would not it be comfortable to develop your support partner organization first? And how do you go about finding and developing your partner organization? Yeah, that's a great question.
That is a good question. It's very much the chicken and egg question. So I would absolutely, if you have an idea of what you want to do, I would absolutely go and, in broad terms, go and bounce it off potential partner organizations and sound out which ones will work with you and which ones won't. Because, there are a lot of organizations that still work in silos. So there'll be a lot of NGOs that when they find out we're a private enterprise, don't want to work with us. And there's a lot of friction there. And we're trying to break down as many of those silos as we can by working with people and proving that actually working together makes more sense. We're going to be there for the long term. A project conducted by an NGO will only be there for as long as they've got the money to run that project, and then they might be in the region but working on a different set of projects. So partly it's just a case of almost speed dating with these various organizations to work out which are the ones you can work with and how you would formalize that. So we have memorandums of understanding rather than formal agreements, because it's just easier to work, I think, on that basis, because you've got more freedom to sort of tweak the plan as you go forward. So, and then to answer your question about which comes first, if you have the organization in place already, then that's fine. If you don't, that's equally fine. I mean, obviously, if you have one, you're more likely to have a meaningful conversation with the organization rather than talking in hypotheticals. But yeah, reach out to as many of them as you can. And what you'll find is it may be the one you approach says it's not for us, but they'll put you in touch with the organization that is a good fit for you.
Right. Does that answer your question, Joseph? Yeah, great. Right. We have Jordan to ask you a question. Jordan, over to you.
Hi, Ian. Thanks so much for your presentation tonight. We've really enjoyed it, and I loved your honesty and transparency in terms of some of the challenges along the way. I actually had a couple of questions, if that's all right. One, starting with to do with just impact measurement. So when you're in the donor world and you've been pitching for, I'm sure, whether it's FCDO or USAID or others, kind of like MEL becomes super important to organizations like this, which can sometimes be a bit of a pain in the backside for startup companies to do. How have you approached that for your organization, first and foremost?
So what we do by trying to work with NGO partners is try and crack that nut, with those guys. So that if you are using money that has, your impact, your level of impact tied to that money, that you can work collaboratively together. So, for example, if we're using part of an NGO's smallholder program, it's very much easier, because they're so much more used to doing it, to take the people who might be scrutinizing us to say, well, look, this is our part in this wider project. And they'll probably have pre-existing relations with those individuals anyway. The other thing that we try to do, and we say this to all the people we potentially work with, is look, we're transparent. We're more than happy for you to come down at any stage you want and see what's going on, because I'm pretty honest with the various DFIs that if we have DFI money, so for example, the Malawi Innovation Challenge Fund money that we had would have been, one of the criteria would have been, the impact that we have and measuring that impact. And they would have a team that would come and work with you and come down to site and come down to the various smallholder locations. And it's about, to my mind, it's about being an open book, because they get the sense that you're trying to fudge the figures. You'll lose your name. And particularly in places like Malawi, it's a very small community. So the next time there's a pot of money available, people will say, haha, yeah, we know about these guys, don't go anywhere near these guys because it's not going to work. And I'm also very lucky that I've got a couple of friends that I grew up with who work in that particular field. So it's always good to be able to reach back to those guys and say, what about and how do you do? But there are a lot of consultants who will charge you an awful lot of money to come and do that sort of measurement for you. And some of the measurements are really difficult. If we're going to say that we're increasing incomes, that's relatively easy because we can prove it by saying we said we'd raise incomes by X amount, and in this last 12 months we've paid this smallholder or these group of smallholders, X amount, and you've got sales figures to prove it. How do we prove that we've had an impact on vitamin A deficiency? That's really difficult. So the only thing we can do in examples like that is you wait for the likes of USAID to come round, and they will do a sort of big annual sweep up of, right, what's the state of the nation now? And you just have to have a common sense approach with whoever your donor might be, to say, look, it's beyond our ability to measure that, and nor would they expect you to. But you need to make sure that if you're having an impact, it's reflected in someone else's report, which again is very difficult.
Super helpful. Is it okay if I just sneak in one more question? I know I should probably get to the back of the queue again to ask one, but just you touched on volatility of currency when you were speaking earlier on in your timeline, and some of the organizations that we support in sub-Saharan Africa, where they're exposed to currency risk. I mean, it can be a real challenge when they take on hard currency loans and then effectively then trying to mobilize that locally. How have you approached that, either in terms of hedging your currency risk or just kind of your thought process as you've approached it as an organization?
Well, we're very lucky, Jordan, in that we principally export as a company, so we're working in dollars anyway. So our local expenditure is kwacha and our income generation is US dollars. Now that causes some frictions because there's so little forex in the country that when you have a company like ours that's generating it, there's all sorts of fees to change it into kwacha, and that becomes quite expensive. We're about to get, if we get this round of investment, the round of investment is from a government financier, it's a government agency, and that'll be in local currency. But because we're earning in, and so that makes it difficult for things like buying of equipment and stuff we want to buy in from overseas. And so the guiding principle there, which it's a bit by the seat of your pants, is to expend your money during the tobacco sales, which are sort of June, July time, when the kwacha is strongest. So obviously you get the biggest bang for your buck. But as one of the guys I'm working with in Malawi, he turned around and said, look, your income generator is US dollars, so actually it's in your interest if the kwacha weakens and you're earning dollars, you have hedged, because you're going to be able to pay your loan off far easier than if you were borrowing dollars and earning kwacha. But it is a massive problem in that part of the world, and it's really difficult for a lot of companies because they don't necessarily have the ability that we do to export.
Yeah. Okay. Clear. Thanks so much, Iain.
Great questions. Thank you, Jordan. We do not have any questions in the chat, but I'm picking up some questions that our participants have put in while registering. But you've covered most of the questions, but there's one that I'm seeing. Is there anything you would have done differently in establishing this social enterprise?
Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the things you do, if you cast your mind back to the rather crazy slide I had with the issues coming in and your timeline going all over the place, I've done a lot of this from a UK base. When I got out of the army in 2016, I sat down with my wife Laura, and we talked quite seriously about, whether or not we should move to Malawi, and she was adamant that, having grown up in Malawi, that she wasn't moving back anytime soon. I see Malawi a little bit through rose-tinted spectacles, because I go for 3 or 4 week bursts, and it's all lovely. It's a beautiful country. The people are lovely, etc., etc., etc. And I don't get worn down by the fact that the power doesn't work. I haven't been worn down by the fact that every drive out of town can be a bone-juddering drive because the highway's got potholes. It's still a bit of an adventure, whereas Laura knows that it's so much different. And one of the other key factors is, for an expat, the cost of living is frighteningly high. So just as an example, it would cost me $36,000 to put the children into a standard international primary school. The rent of a house to live in would be pretty high, etc., etc. So there's a lot of things to consider. But the thing I would change is the amount of time I spent on the ground, because trying to conduct the orchestra from the UK, albeit we have a capable team in Malawi, there's no substitute for seeing something firsthand, because generally speaking, and particularly culturally with Malawians, they'll tell you what you want to hear, and they'll try and, in the time they know that they've got before you come out again in a couple of months' time, they'll try and fix the problem, and inevitably they'll make it worse, because they don't want to be the one to give you bad news. So definitely more time at the coalface early on, because we could have headed off a whole number of problems. As an example, had I been in country more during the trial 400,000 tree planting that we did with the BRIC consultancy and the World Bank program, then maybe we wouldn't have been paying for $15,000 worth of certification to take place when there's no trees to certify.
Right, that's a great achievement indeed. Yeah, so and there's another question, like most difficult moments throughout the journey, and did you ever consider leaving it? So I recall you mentioned about the differences between your own family and your wife's family, how your family has been against it. But what kept you going, that motivation there? What did you your vision for Moringa Miracles, and did you reach there? And maybe looking forward, maybe within the next couple of years, or even on the long term, what are your visions?
So I think, trying to do anything like this, and social enterprise aside, trying to start your own business, it's going to be a roller coaster. There are going to be times where everything's working swimmingly well, and then something comes out of left field that you just did not anticipate, whatsoever. And you just, sometimes you can prepare for that sort of thing, and sometimes you absolutely can't. And sometimes, particularly once you get up and running, when things are just on a business plan, or they're quite sort of ethereal, the knocks are easy to take because it's not costing you any money. But as soon as you have real people and a real cash flow headache in the mix, that's when it brings stuff into sharper focus, because ultimately, if there's a shortfall in money, you've got to cover it somehow. And I remember last summer having to make payroll with my credit card, which was a bit of a shock to the system. And at that point, you're really sitting down thinking, right, number one, I haven't been paid for 4 years, because my wife thankfully has got a good enough job that we can keep trying to plug away at this project. I've just made payroll with my credit card, and actually, career-wise for me, what am I doing? Because if it's a success, it's time well spent. But if it, for whatever reason, if we fail, when I then go back into the job market, so what have you been doing for the last 4 years? Well, last 4 years I've spent trying to do this and it didn't really work, and they'll look at it and go, so what have you been doing? And do you get the credit for the effort that you've put in? But then all you have to do is look at the potential impact, look at the impact you're having already. Talk to the partner organizations that you have about the fact that in their programs, the Moringa's doing really well. They can already see the benefit it's having to the children with stunted growth, etc. And you just think, we can't fail. we can't allow this to fail. And that's where you get into the sort of the difficult balancing act territory of being too stubborn to say it's finally time. And I think sadly we've got to that point currently with cash flow just now, where if this round of investment doesn't sort of come to fruition, rounds of investment take so long to go from a warm introductory conversation to potential term sheets, you know, talking, I would say on average about 6 months for that to happen. You've suddenly got to find 6 months of cash flow in order to, you know, to sort of limp along to the next potential round of investment. So we've got a big decision coming up. If they turn around and say no, then, you know, we've got to do a lot of soul searching and try and be realistic. If they turn around and say yes, then, as someone said to me the other day, that the hard work starts.
Amazing. It's definitely a roller coaster journey indeed. And yeah, I really love your motivation there. I mean, starting a social enterprise and keeping going is definitely not an easy thing. And yeah, we really love that motivation there. So yeah, we have actually reached the end of our talk, and 1 hour just flew by. Thanks a lot for your insights, and it's been really great. I'm sure all the participants has learned a lot from this. And thank you guys, for all of you, for making the time to attend this session today, and for your questions and everything. Do connect with Iain, and if you have any further questions on social enterprise, do not hesitate to drop him a message in LinkedIn. I'm sure he will be very happy to give you more insights. Yeah, thanks a lot, Iain. Thanks for the wonderful session.
No worries, absolute pleasure. And if people want to find me emails via Warwick, that's also absolutely fine. So so easy to find on the Warwick email system.
Right, great.
Cool.